Hey everybody, it's Victor here. So today I wanted to talk about how combat works in EU4, as you can tell, but I also wanted to talk about how everybody seems to think cavalry is bad, and if that is true or not. Now the reason I wanted to talk about this is, as I've said before, I'm in multiple multiplier games, but I also am on Discord and I see plenty of people ask about army composition or why they're losing a war quite often, and usually the answer is cavalry or they're building too much artillery. So this is to help go through what is going on in combat, which then should answer the questions about should you be building cavalry, when you should be doing it, if you should be having a full line of artillery, when, etc. So part of this confusion resulted from a couple of years ago. Arumba made a video where he said that cavalry is bad. And he is right in that video with the point he was making. However, you have to understand the point he was making and why it is not entirely true in all situations. He was saying that cavalry is bad because you're paying 2.5 times the amount of an infantryman, but you're not getting 2.5 times the strength of that infantryman, which is absolutely true. Most of the time you are not getting that. You can get it in times, but not always. Here's the thing. It is not about whether or not they are going to be twice as strong or 2.5 times as strong as infantry. It is whether or not it will make you win the war. Because the fact is that if you fight all infantry and lose, sure, your economy didn't take the strain, but you still lost the war. And only going with infantry in single player when you're punching downwards, so you're fighting weaker opponents, you can absolutely do that. But fighting somebody of equal strength in single player or stronger in single player or being in multiplayer, going all infantry is usually a recipe for disaster and you getting wiped out. So this is an answer to that. So what you see in front of you are the 4 equations that explain how combat works in EU4. The first equation is quite simply pips. And then there's multipliers, and if you look, those 2 equations are feeder equations. They both feed into the next 2 equations. So we have to start there, and then we can move on. Now, before I move further, there's going to be times when you will not see everything on this screen. I am going to post the link to this spreadsheet below in either the description or in a comment, so you guys can follow that link and bring it up and see everything I was talking about whenever you guys want to. That said, these images are breaking for some reason, so if that happens, they're not going to be there, but all the equations will. And lastly, you're going to see a lot of equations. You don't need to do them. I'm going to explain to you how they work so you can kind of do most of the mental math yourself. So let's start with pips. I wanted you guys to look at these 2 units first because it kind of explains what pips is. The first part of it is the roll. It's just simply the dice roll. Between 0 and 9, whatever you happen to roll, that is what gets put in there. Hopefully, you don't roll a 0. The next part of this equation is the leaders. Now, the max 0 part of this means is that no matter what, you cannot go below 0. So if your leader is a 0 shock guy and you're fighting a guy that has 5 shock, you don't have -5 in here. You have 0. They will have 5, but you at least have 0. You do not lose damage because your general is bad. You simply don't do as much damage as the enemy. If that makes sense, I hope it does. The terrain part of this equation, the very end, this is simply defensive terrain. So if somebody's fighting in the forest or the marshes where it takes away 1, that is where it gets taken away. The last 2 are what I wanted to talk about, the attack pips and defense pips. So if this halberd infantry and the chevauché were fighting each other, the halberd has 1 offensive pip in shock, which gets countered by the defensive pip in the chevauché. So it would be +1 -1 equals 0. But at the same time, chevauché is attacking the halberd, which would be a 1 offensive shock there, but there is no defensive shock pip in the halberd. So it would be +1 -0 equals 1, which, if I go to the next tab, I've already done all of them. And I'm only covering Western tech group and Anatolian, and I'm having them fight each other as well as their own tech group. I wanted to clarify one thing that's kind of important here. If you are dealing with the nomad tech group, there is an extra modifier in all this, which is they get a 25% bonus shock damage with their cavalry if it is flatland terrain, and a 25% debuff if it is not flat terrain. What that means is if you are going to be fighting in very mountainous or hilly or non-flat terrain such as Tibet, do not take cavalry there, period. Don't do it. You're going to be facing massive penalties. Other than that, these are the basic rules you're going to follow. Now, as you can tell, they're all relatively equal. And I did not do the fire because no units at Tech 3 have fire pips. None of them. But if you notice, the Latin Medieval versus the Chevauché is -1. While you cannot go negative between the leaders, you can go negative with everything else. So be sure you take that into consideration because it's going to matter. However, you also have Musulem, which have 2 pips on shock against Latin Medieval. Why? Because Latin Medieval does not have a defensive shock pip, whereas Musulem Cavalry have 2 shock offensive pips. Morale, you do the exact same thing here, except instead of using shock or fire, you do morale. So it's the exact same equation. Not any real difficulty here, I just wanted to show you this. Let's move on to the next equation that's a feeder, and it is the multipliers. Now this one is a bit more involved, but while it looks intimidating, not really that intimidating. You see the first modifier here is strength. This simply means how many men you have in each regiment. So if you have a 1,000-man regiment, a full regiment, this is going to be 1,000 over 1,000 or 1. If you have 500 men, it's going to be 1/2, so it reduces the amount of damage you're doing by half. That's all that means. The next part is a bit more involved. You see, damage is what you're seeing on the left. Now, this you will see in the tech window, and it will tell you how much fire damage and shock damage your infantry is doing, and cavalry damage, artillery damage, all of that is in your tech window. And this is the same regardless of what your tech group is. So Western Tech, Anatolian Tech, Nomad Tech, they're all following this tech damage tree. It's the exact same. The pips will be different, but this is not. And then you have tactics. This is military tactics. So these are also the same regardless of tech group. And at Tech 3, you start at 0.5, and I believe it goes up to 2.75 or 3.25, I'm not sure what. But it will get up there as you go through in tech. The difference here, however, is damage is not modified by discipline until later on in the equation, as you can see. But discipline does modify tactics. But your tactics are going to be modified in the enemy's damage equation. In other words, when your unit is attacking somebody, the tactics you put in here are the enemy's. And it is modified by discipline in the exact same percentage that you would expect. So if they have 5% discipline, you take the tactics amount, which in this case is 0.5, and you multiply that by 1.05, leading them to have a military tactics of 0.52. So you'd put that in here. They would not if you don't have 5 discipline. And it does not matter what your discipline is. You do the math for their discipline in the tactics. So even if they have 20 discipline and you only have 10, you still just put 20 here. You don't bother with the differences. The same is true with this discipline over here. You do whatever it is your actual discipline is. Same with combat ability. Doesn't matter what the enemy's is. What round is, however, is what day of combat you are in. So day 1 would be 1. Day 2 would be 2. Day 3 would be 3. The reason this matters is because the damage that is being output is going to go up because this will increase this multiplier. You see, the reason why it is 0.707 or 1.01 or 2.02 is because while 0.35 divided by 0.5 is 7, this extra 1 over here for the first day is increasing it by 0.07. Oh, sorry, 0.007 or 0.01 or 0.02. This will simply go up every day. So I am treating this as all day 1. If you want to do the more in detailed math, you can if you want, but you don't necessarily have to. And if you didn't notice, cavalry do not get any fire damage at all until 11. So they will always have a 0 here because 0 over any other number is going to be 0, and it doesn't matter how many times you multiply it, it's still going to be 0. So let's look at the actual damage it is doing to manpower. This is the Equation 4, manpower casualties. Now, if you see, it's basically being rooted around 15, and it will go up by another third for every pip. So pips are fairly important. That is why, because even one pip will add another 5 damage on there, even with a modifier of just 1. Right here, as you see with Latin Medieval versus Latin Medieval, there's no pips. So it's not increasing it from 15 at all. But 15 times 0.07 leads to about 10.5 casualties per day. This is 1 stack per day of fire combat. As you see, though, cavalry have absolute 0 because they do absolute 0 damage. But if you get into the shock phase, here, because the multiplier is higher, they're doing the full 15 damage. When you go down 1, you have the halberds, which add another 5, making it 20 instead of 15. But then if you look at the cavalry, they also only have 1 pip, but because the modifier is doubled, they are doing twice as many casualties. And then with the Muslim versus Latin Medieval, they're doing 50 casualties because it's adding the 2 pips, which is another 10, making it 25, and then doubling that to 50. Obviously, if you had other things in there, it would increase that. Now, to talk about these other modifiers, because I'm still setting them as all equal, this damage modifier, what that effectively means is the Texas ability of plus 10% fire damage. That is what the damage modifier is. The damage received modifier, that is the Prussian minus 20% fire damage received. That is all that means. You enter them here. Now, let's go back to the original equations for a bit, because I wanted to explain this part. A lot of people say that those are the worst modifiers. The reason why people say that is if you look at where they are. Combat ability, discipline, the pips, all of these things will impact both manpower and morale. Because this last equation is the morale equation. The multipliers go in there too, so do the pips. But these other modifiers only matter for casualties, for manpower deaths. So if you're going for that, which you will be late game, they're amazing. Early game, when you're fighting morale, they're not so effective. It's great to maintain your manpower, but it's not going to be what wins you battles. But I'll get to that later. So let's go ahead and look at this, though. So, as I said before, it's not always going to be 2.5 times the casualties, but Muslim versus Latin Medieval, they do 50 shock damage. Latin Medieval versus Muslim, in terms of shock, do 10. And as you guys saw from the fire damage, they also do 10. If you do the math there, you'll find out pretty quickly that Muslim versus Latin Medieval are getting that 2.5 versus Latin Medieval. They will get that also, not quite, with other unit types as well. But yes, they are absolutely worth it. Even Chevauché, where you're getting twice as many, it's still kind of worth it. Now with morale, it is a bit different. You see, with morale here, there is a different equation. And if you look at this, max morale is a new variable that's introduced here. Now this is about damage. So what happens is, and sorry, as I said before, the images are kind of broken. Max morale also increases the amount of morale damage you are doing. So if you have the most morale, you are not just going to win because you can outlast your opponent. You're going to win because you can out-damage your opponent. So absolutely, especially early game, get your morale up because it helps substantially. But if you look, there's another variable in here, and I want to talk about it briefly before I move on, RO. RO is simply the Army Professionalism modifier that reduces the reserve morale damage that's taken by half. So instead of taking 0.03, which is the flat morale damage you can take, it makes it 0.015. That's it. That's all it does. I'm treating it if you don't have that, just to make the math easier. But as you can see here, the multiplier is the same. Pips are the exact same. It's just using morale. But cavalry, even though they do 0 damage with their multiplier, they still get that 0.03, which means they're not really that behind when it comes to morale damage. That said, Chevauché are paying the price because they lack that defensive morale pip. With shock, though, they also get that double modifier with morale damage, though everybody has a defensive morale pip except for halberd and chevauché. So they get increased damage from that. But that's about it. Here's the key difference here. You're picking between, do you cause morale damage or do you cause manpower damage? And this is kind of a quick summary of what those are. So you have the yellow, which is the fire manpower damage, the peachish, which is the shock manpower damage, green, which is the morale fire damage that you're taking, and then the blue is the shock morale. I use the wrong word with this average. It's really just a combination of those two numbers, and then I multiplied them by 3 to get the full 6-day cycle. Why I did 6 days is because the cycle is 3 days worth of fire, and then you do 3 days of shock, and then it goes back and forth until one army wins. So in 6 days, a Latin medieval infantry versus a Latin medieval infantry, with everything being as equal as possible, will do 77 manpower damage to one another and do about 0.53 morale damage. If you look, the chevauché against the Latin medieval infantry are doing a bit more morale simply because they have more of that modifier behind them, and they are doing about 40% more casualties. So are Western medieval knights. So they can do the damage and stick in there with morale. But if you look, the Latin medieval versus the chevauché are doing even more morale damage back. They're just not doing as much actual manpower damage back. Meaning you're doing about double in actuality if you're actually using chevauché. Muslim, they keep up with the morale. However, they are, again, doing 2.5 times the manpower damage to Latin medieval infantry than they're taking. So what does this mean? This means if you are fighting Western versus Anatolian, as the Anatolian, you absolutely want to be using cavalry as much as possible against their infantry. And if you are Western, you want to prevent that as much as possible. Simply because if you don't, they are going to rip you apart, piece by piece. And while your cavalry are going to get hit hard too, you will at least be able to hang in there with a bit more of a parity. So that is what I'm showing here. The math that is done when you have armies in a couple of different situations. So first one hit here in the top left, 16 Latin medieval infantry versus 4 chevauché versus 16 Yaya infantry and 4 Muslim. Below are halberds instead of Latin medieval infantry. The Western medieval knights, they do the shock damage, but they take as much shock damage as the halberds do, or the Latin medieval infantry, but they hang in there with the morale. So they will do more damage, but they will still take as much damage, if that makes sense. So what do you end up with here? With the Latin medieval infantry, you have about 1,600 casualties you're causing, and 24 morale damage. In return, you're getting about 2,000 casualties and 25 morale damage. In other words, with the chevauché, you are not keeping up with the morale, but in exchange, you do a bit of damage. Now, if you did not have the chevauché, they're actually all the way over here, you're doing about 100 manpower damage less for a little bit better of morale that you're taking. So you're not really keeping up, if that makes sense. Because if they will do about 2,000 manpower to you, you'll do about 1,500 to them. So it increases the manpower gap, but it decreases to nothing the morale difference. If you go with halberds, you are creating a parity between the two of you in terms of manpower, but you're increasing the morale difference. And if you get rid of the cavalry, you're increasing the manpower difference, but you're not really changing anything with morale. And that's kind of what you're doing here. You are going to be a little bit better off with halberds, but you really should be maintaining your cavalry just to try and reach parity. And if it's not obvious, you need to desperately try and make sure your infantry, especially your Latin medieval infantry, are not being targeted by their cavalry. which means you need to send somebody out there that can absorb some of that damage, such as the chevauchée. Because while you might lose the morale, you can come back with an army later in most circumstances, such as Austria versus Ottomans. The reason why? Austria gets about 600 manpower a month. The Ottomans get about 250. So you can hang in there longer with manpower and simply keep coming back. And the Ottomans are trying to bleed you dry. So you cannot have your manpower get there fast enough to keep your army actually ready to fight. That's it. As the Ottomans, you are trying to hit them as hard as you can to get rid of as much manpower as you can, so they cannot keep a full army in the field, which makes them get back and hire mercenaries that you could end up bankrupting the enemy with. That is your tactic. That is what you are trying to do. So let's go ahead and skip forward to when cavalry is starting to fall off, because early on, they are really where you're going to do most of your damage with. And as far as the people that say you get 4 cavalry, that's not always true, because as you can see here, Anatolians, you want as much cavalry as possible. If you are playing the Western tech group, you want to have as many Western medieval knights against each other as possible. The reason why is if they're not going halberd, you're taking an equal amount of morale damage as against Latin medieval infantry, but you are causing more manpower casualties. If they're using halberds, use chevauchée because that neutralizes the halberds and you beat them on morale. And you want to have as much of that being your advantage as possible. So it's not just 4. You try to figure out how much the enemy is going to try and afford to put out in the field, and you try to match that. If they're doing 4, try and do 6. That's all it is. So let's go ahead and move on to Tech 20. Now, Tech 20 is where things start changing a little bit. And the reason why is because now artillery is in the field. Now, the reason I'm showing you Tech 20 is because this is largely the last point in time when you want to have cavalry in the field. And I'll get to why later, but I wanted to show what happens at Tech 20. You see, the Ottomans and the Europeans flip in roles. At this point, as you can tell, Gustav versus Janissary and Janissary versus Gustav, they're relatively close. However, Gustav versus the cavalry of the Ottomans is not going to be as effective as it coming back. You're getting roughly equal returns here. However, you need to make absolutely certain that their cavalry do not engage you as an Ottoman troop. Now, while your cavalry versus their cavalry is still not a great equation, it is better than having them fight your Janissaries. And your Janissaries against their cavalry are just atrociously bad. So now, as an Anatolian, you're trying to put out as much cavalry as you can to at least equal the amount of Western infantry you have. After that, it's better to have infantry facing infantry for you. As a Western tech group, you want to outnumber their cavalry because then you could rip them apart. So it's the exact same thing, just flipped an equation. Now, why do I want to talk about Tech 20? Because Tech 20 is when more of the defensive pips start being added. You get half of whatever the defensive pips are, 4 cannons, rounded down. So at Tech 20, that means you will have 1 extra fire defensive pip and 1 defensive morale pip. And that's what causes these to have this effect. The reason why you are able to hang in there as Janissaries instead of Gustavian is not because Janissaries are okay. It is because you have the defensive fire pip in there to help protect you. The reason why cavalry do not do as well is simply because they don't have enough defensive fire pips to be able to resist the damage that's coming at them from pretty much all the fire damage. So if I scroll down here, you'll see the kind of casualties you're looking at. Now this is 4 Gallop Cavalry, 30 Gustav Infantry versus 34 Gustav Infantry. So 2 solid lines, just one has 4 Gallop Cavalry. And it's right next to what happens if you add another 6 Gallop Cavalry. So you can kind of see the difference here. You get an extra 200-ish cavalry damage in total manpower damage from the cavalry. You get a bit more morale. But then with cannons, you're getting another about 800. Not a massive number, but not an unimpressive number. So you want to have the artillery there. But cavalry, as you can tell, they're just not adding a whole lot, but they are definitely worth having. Because again, you either want to out-cavalry them or at least make sure they don't out-cavalry you. But what happens after Tech 20 is this, and this is Tech 30 because it kind of highlights it in a very big way. At Infantry versus Infantry at Tech 30, without any other modifiers, you have 30 casualties. When it's against Cavalry, it's 50. Cavalry versus the Infantry, it's 75. Against each other, it's 80. But it's right here with the artillery. See, the artillery against infantry is another 30, but it's 90 against cavalry. That means even if it's cavalry against cavalry, they're just ripping each other apart with the artillery. And if you're going against infantry, that infantry and artillery versus infantry is going to simply not match up to the amount of damage coming towards the cavalry and the artillery. And the reason why is what happens with the multipliers with the shock pips, or sorry, not the shock pips, the fire pips from the artillery, and the massive amount of artillery fire coming at you. Now, if you look at the artillery fire right here, you'll see that Tech 7, it's only 1. That's what you start with shock damage from a cavalryman. It's just not there. They have enough defensive pips to reduce that amount from artillery fire. Or they're simply not taking a whole lot. That way you're getting more from cavalry. At Tech 13, you increase it by another 4. Not a massive amount, but it is okay. At Tech 16, you get another pip, which almost doubles it. But again, at that point, you're getting more defensive fire pips, so it's not very impressive, but definitely not something to ignore. At Tech 22, it doubles again, and this is where it gets dangerous, because you're getting enough pips there where the cavalry simply don't have them, and they're doing enough damage where that multiplier starts going up by a lot. At Tech 25, it is insane the amount of damage that these artilleries can put downfield. And while you are getting half of their fire defense pips to help protect you against them, if you actually look, you only have, if I recall correctly, 2 fire defense pips as cavalry, but you have 4 as a Napoleonic square. Which means that as a Napoleonic square, you can take these artillery blasts, as you can tell, with relative ease. Cavalry, you cannot. And these numbers are over 2 days. So over 2 days, just with the fire phase, the cavalry is taking so much damage, or sorry, the full fire phase. It's not 2 days, it's 3. You're taking enough damage there to make it so cavalry is not worth having in the field. So you want to have all infantry. So hopefully that helps explain at what point you're supposed to have cavalry and at what point you need to start phasing them out, and I'll explain them why later if you didn't quite catch on. So this is what happens if you add modifiers. Now, as you can see, I did both Tech 30 and Tech 3. At Tech 3, it is not that impressive to have discipline because your multiplier is so low that it's multiplying with the damage number. It's just not worth it to do it. Later on, that starts drastically increasing, especially with artillery and that second line coming into play with artillery fire coming in, that it ramps up a lot. But early on, discipline, not that impressive. However, the pips are where you get most of your damage. So if you can possibly fish for a general, fish for a general. If you don't have that ability, it can hurt. Don't let the enemy have better pips than you and fight on defensive terrain. At Tech 30, as you can see, combat ability, while it does help, it's simply not going to help as much as a pip would. But that pip is not going to help as much as 5 discipline. And this is without the artillery advantages or any of that. It is simply infantry versus infantry with no artillery. The discipline matters more because that multiplier gets higher. It helps with every aspect, and this is without the extra pip, so it is more than making up for a pip. So if you don't happen to have the pip advantage, you'll be fine later on if you have enough discipline. Now, I wanted to do this to show you both Tech 3 and Tech 30 that discipline, if you have enough, can be better than morale. Because again, if you look at the base equation at the very beginning, this discipline goes into multipliers, which also goes into morale damage. So if you go heavy defensive, it will not only help you early on, but it will also help you late game. So if you have something where it's a choice between having a policy of discipline versus having a policy of morale, go with discipline. And of course, pips matter more early game and then are still important late game, but realistically, late game when it comes to morale, that's not what you're really focusing on. You're focusing on damage and causing as much casualties as possible. And that you get with discipline. So to summarize, and again, it looks like the link's broke, but to summarize what you're trying to do, you want to have cavalry from the very beginning of the game, as much as you can afford, to at least either prevent the enemy from having more cavalry than you, or to have more cavalry than your enemy. And if you are a Sunni nation, that helps you out because you get more of an infantry-cavalry ratio, which will help you out cavalry your enemies. So go ahead and do as many as you can afford if you absolutely have to win those fights. Discipline is important throughout the game. However, it becomes drastically more important after Tech 16. When you hit Tech 16, you can go ahead and completely start to focus entirely on discipline. And I would recommend getting discipline before anything with combat ability, because it's going to matter significantly more when you actually start getting into the massively dangerous fields. Pips are always going to be important for you, whether early game or late game, but it's going to matter more early game. And your cavalry you need to have start phasing out at Tech 20. You can have them between 16 and 20. They're going to still be relevant. However, you can phase them out at that point to save money, because then artillery is starting to catch up. At Tech 22, you need to not have any cavalry. They are going to take too much damage to make them worthwhile. Until that point, they are still perfectly fine. Up until Tech 16 is where they shine. After that is when they don't. Which, if you look at the tech numbers, is halfway through the game. Now, a good way to understand what point this is roughly around the League War is the last time you want to have cavalry. After that point, they start getting phased out because they get a little bit better at Tech 17, but at that point, you need to start getting ready for them to be phased out. And at Tech 22, you should already have a full line of artillery. You should have a full line by the League War just to put out more damage downfield. But you can do it once you can afford it. Try and do it at Tech 16. Don't do it earlier. They're not worth it any time earlier. But that point, definitely do it. This should be enough for you guys to understand how this all works. And as you guys can tell on here, please turn on the bell button. I have a lot of these to get rid of because I don't want them. And I'm going to be putting them in here so you guys can grab them. Whoever gets it first gets it first. I don't care if it's the same person. I don't care if you don't really want it. Just leave it for the next person. I only ask you put in the comments who gets it, just so we can know who got it. Other than that, I hope this helps all of you get better and makes it so you guys can win those fights that you weren't winning before, or makes you just that much more dangerous when it comes to multiplayer, because all of a sudden you have an army that is actually balanced around beating your enemy, not keeping your economy afloat, when what matters more is not that your economy is great, but that you win a fight that is a death war. This is how you do it. So I thank you guys for watching. If you like this kind of comment, like and subscribe. I will be doing more of it, but if there is a specific mechanic, whether it's trade, or why tax is bad, or a country nation guide, or whatever it happens to be, leave it in the comment below. I'd be more than happy to talk about it, but thank you all for watching. Hope you all have a great day.